Hey everyone, welcome to our first talk of the speaker series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Camp, Assistant Professor in Organizational Studies, and I'll say two wonderful things about organizing the speaker series. Well, three. First one is just the wonderful slate of speakers that we have. The second is that I get to get myself out of the way first so I can take in all the other talks. And the third is that since I'm introducing myself, I don't have to stand and listen to someone go through my CV. I can just tell you welcome and my name, affiliation, email are on the board. And today I'm going to be talking about, so the goal of the speaker series is to ask what makes systemic racism systemic, and specifically what are ways of looking beyond individual prejudices when we're thinking about the social psychology of racial inequality. And today I'm going to be offering one answer to that question, which is looking at institutional interactions, specifically in the context of policing, and how these interactions tell us about psychology of policing and being policed. And I'd like to start with a broader question. Where are we now and how did we get here? We're about 10 years into the Black Lives Matter movement, 4 years post George Floyd, and the high profile killings of Tyree Nichols, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others have sparked national attention, not just to the actions of specific officers, but to the broader way in which policing institutions interact with people of color. And to understand the system, we can place each of these acute instances of police force in the context of a broader system of policing. So according to the Washington Post Fatal Shootings Database, about 1,100 people were killed by police in the last year. But we know from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that about 22 million people are stopped by police. And so the question I ask in my research is, what role do these common encounters play in fostering or undermining police community trust? And when we think about police and racial inequality from the standpoint of psychology, a lot of social psychology is sought to answer these questions by looking within individual officers. So you can think of processes of stereotyping and discrimination in the context of racial profiling or shooter bias. What I think that these perspectives miss is this interactional part of policing and how police officers are different than undergraduates and how these interactions are different than those commonly studied in social psychology. And the core idea for today is that police encounters are distinct because they're institutional interactions. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you're interacting with a police officer, you're interacting with someone in a dual role. One aspect of this role is that in addition to acting on their own discretion, police officers are agents subject to organizational influence. So when we focus specifically on individual officer biases, we miss out on how policing organizations direct that discretion. The flip side of it is that you can't speak to a police department. You can't have a conversation with the institution of policing. Rather, we interact with this institution through institutional agents such as police officers. Another way of putting it is that police officers are the human face of these organizations. So in my research, I look at both of these directions. I look at how departmental policies guide individual officer discretion in subsequent encounters. But today I'm going to be focusing on this first path. And specifically, what the research I'm going to talk about today looks at how police officers communicate to Black and white citizens and what the consequences of these communications are for community trust. So I'm not the first to argue for the importance of routine encounters in building or eroding trust. Theories of procedural justice have long talked about the role that these interactions and people's experiences of respect or disrespect play in establishing legitimacy. However, there's a real problem when it comes to examining police behavior, and that's that many of these important relational parts of policing take place out of sight. So when you think about sources of data we have on police behavior, a lot of it takes the form of administrative records, so stop data reports, third-party databases like the Washington Post's, but there's sparse data on how police officers actually interact and converse with the public. By that token, another source of data we have on policing comes from community members' self-report. So to what extent do community members feel respected or disrespected in their exchanges with the police? Again, this is consequential. This has been shown to meaningfully correlate with cooperation with police officers, but it can't tell us how different people might perceive or experience the same interaction. And then when it comes to establishing causality, manipulating police behavior is not impossible in research, but it's extremely challenging. And experiments that have sought to change police officer communication often do so in very limited circumstances like DUI checkpoints. So this question is a psychological question, and it seems straightforward, but there's difficulties in observing police interactions. So, another option could be riding along with a police officer and observing how they interact with the public, and many researchers have done this. However, this is pretty obtrusive, and there's been other research that's shown that police officers actually conduct more stops when they have ride-along observers. There's also issues with how data scales and poses a real challenge for answering these basic questions about police-community relations. However, this has changed over the last decade with the advent and rapid adoption of body-worn cameras. So as of most recent estimates, most large police departments have either adopted or have planned to adopt body-worn cameras. And we've also been exposed to these videos in the context of incidents such as the Tyreek Hill stop or other cases of police violence. And these cameras were really introduced to be a source of evidence for police accountability. The idea being that if there is a critical incident, you can go look at these recordings and figure out what really happened. We know from other psychological research that the visual perspective of these cameras introduces biases in perception. In other ways, these are not the best source of evidence. What we haven't paid attention to, however, is how these recordings can be used as a source of data, as a way of not just trying to reconstruct what happened in particular cases of use of force, but as a way of looking across large amounts of interactions to see how these routine exchanges unfold. So what can this footage tell us about common but consequential interactions like traffic stops? My colleagues and I sought to answer this question in a department that was an early adopter of body cameras. So most of the work I'm going to talk about today took place in Oakland, California. Oakland was one of the early adopters of body-worn cameras due to its consent decree. And at the time we conducted this work, OPD policy required officers to activate cameras before contacting the driver in traffic stops. So we looked at body camera footage from about 900 stops of black and white drivers in Oakland that took place in a single month, conducted by roughly 230 officers. And for each of these stops, we had the footage professionally transcribed to give us basically a script of how these interactions unfolded. So you'll hear me use the term utterance a lot. So an utterance is just one line in the script. And we had transcriptions of officer and community member. I should also add that one other advantage of body camera footage is just the scale at which this data exists. The more that police departments adopt body cameras as a matter of their typical operations, just the more footage they accumulate. And so even from this relatively small sample of footage, we had over 36,000 officer utterances. So this footage lets us do three things that we couldn't do before. First, we can examine the content of body camera footage to look at differences in communication with, between officers and black and white drivers. Second, we can manipulate what interactions people are exposed to estimate the causal effects of officer communication for institutional trust. And third, because these recordings exist outside of people's individual experiences, we can see how different people would view the same exact interaction. It gives us a way of measuring how differences in people's experience and perception shapes what they take away from these recordings. So I'm going to start today's talk with the first piece of this cycle, specifically looking at racial disparities in officer language. And we approach this question because words are one of the most powerful tools at a police officer's disposal. They carry the force of law, and by using them, officers can communicate very similar ideas in ways that connote respect or lack thereof. So most traffic stops involve the driver giving their documents to the police officer. Officer could ask for this by saying something like, "Would you mind getting your license and registration for me, please, and thank you." Or they could communicate the same substantive command by just saying, "Okay, bro, give me your driver's license and registration." So from this corpus, or this large set of 36,000 utterances that we had from a month of traffic stops, we had human participants go through and rate thin slices of officer language. So the way this would work is that you're the participant in this study. You have utterance from the community member to give some context. How does this work? Are they going to send me something in the mail? And then you see what the officer said. No, go down to the courthouse. You see way at the bottom where he checked it. And what we asked our participants to do in this task was to respond how impartial, respectful, friendly, polite, and formal the officer was. In other words, how respectfully is this officer communicating with the driver that they've stopped? And I should add that in this task, participants are blind to the race of the driver the officers pulled over. So over the years, we've run many different iterations of this study. Originally, we conduct our analyses with Stanford undergrads. My research assistants and I went to a Bay Area DMV office, and we've also conducted a pre-registered replication with just a completely different sample of utterances. And the results are quite similar across samples. So on the y-axis, we have just the composite of those items I showed you, ranges from 1 to 4. And I want you to take away 2 things from this graph. First, most things that most officers say are neutral to relatively respectful. Most of these all these bars are above the midpoint. However, in each of these samples of utterances and participants, we observe this disparity in respect, where officers are communicating more deference, more respect towards white versus black drivers. So these results are suggestive, but we're faced with a problem. How do we go from the relatively small sample of utterances that were rated by people to the large corpus of footage that we have from this month of body camera recordings? So basically what we did was we trained a computer to walk through, read these utterances, and use the same features that people used to make these judgments. But I'll just walk through this briefly step by step. So first step was we identified linguistic features from the literature about politeness and respect. So things like acknowledgements, informal titles, other things, we're in request season. So if you're sending a request to your professor, you might say, Dr. Camp, I'd like just a little more time to work on my assignment, please and thank you. Things to kind of minimize the imposition, as well as things like direct requests or informal titles. So what we did was we saw how much each of these features predicted our participants' judgments of respect. So we ended up with a model with these different features and their weights that basically agreed with human ratings to the extent that any one person agreed with the other raters. And we're in the age of LLMs. I'll say we consciously tried to make this a transparent model and that you can read out each of these features and their weights in the final one. So after finding our best fitting model, our algorithm graduated, and we set it to work annotating all the utterances in the corpus. In other words, for each of these lines in the script, the algorithm would go through, identify these different features, apply the weights, and give us a respect score for every single one of the utterances in our scripts. So before going through the quantitative results, I just want to share some of the ways in which police officers' interactions with white and black drivers differed. So when officers were talking to white drivers, they were more likely to use formal titles, just saying things like, "Okay, ma'am, do you have your insurance and registration, sir?" They were more likely to express concern for white drivers' safety. So saying things like, "I'm glad you're safe. I just want you and your baby to be safe." And they were also more reassuring towards white drivers. So saying things like, "Don't worry about it, it's all good." So what we can do for each of the features in our linguistic model is to chart how respectful or disrespectful they are on the y-axis with how likely they are to occur in stops of white drivers versus black drivers on the x-axis. So these are all the features. Again, if you look at the vertical part of this graph, you can see that things like apologizing and saying thank you are seen as more respectful. Informal titles are more disrespectful. But the other thing you can see here is you can basically draw a diagonal line through this, showing the correlation between the likelihood of a feature occurring when officers are talking to white drivers and the respect of that feature. In other words, the more respectful an aspect of language, the more likely it is to come up in officers' conversations when they're talking to white drivers. So the fact that we have this data at the utterance level lets us rule out some alternative explanations for this disparity. So we find that it's not driven by the officers. There aren't differences by officer race. There's not, these disparities exist, even accounting for disparity or for differences based off of the driver's age or gender, as well as the location for the stop. But I think the more exciting thing we get from this data is that we can go into each interaction to see what is the trajectory. In other words, how respectful are these interactions from the first moment, and how respectful are they when the officer closes out that interaction. So I'm going to show you two lines. On the x-axis here, we have the relative time point that utterance occurs in the interaction. And on the y-point, we have, on the y-axis, we have how respectful that utterance is. And I'm going to show you the line for black drivers and for white drivers. And I want you to just pay attention to where these lines start and where they end up. Okay. So the first question we got from our reviewers was, how do we know these disparities aren't driven by how black and white drivers are interacting with the police officers? What you can see here is that these disparities emerge in the earliest moments of police interactions. In other words, these interactions with white and black drivers start off with differing levels of respect. The second thing you'll notice is that over time, these interactions grow more respectful, but there's also differences in the slope of these two lines. So this gap in respect actually increases over time. So language is a single channel of communication, but it's a limited one, right? As my wife likes to tell me, it's not just what you say, but how you say it. So in a second set of studies, we sought to expand on this work by looking at disparities in a really subtle interpersonal cue, and that's the police officer's tone of voice. So we created clips of police officers talking to white and black men from these traffic stops, and we edited these clips in two ways. First, we cut out the driver's speech, so participants only heard the police officer. And second, we applied a filter that masked the content of what police officers were saying while preserving their tone of voice. So I'm going to play two clips for you, and it's going to sound like the grown-ups in Charlie Brown. That's by design. That isn't a bug. Here's the first one.
Okay, we can take that. You have your picture in here? Okay.
That's by design, yep. I'm glad. And then here's the second one.
Okay. Okay. Is that two in here? Is that your name in here? What's your name? Did you have another type of interpretation besides this? Either right idea or anything like that.
So for those of you who had trouble hearing, it sounded like bomp, 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 bomp on purpose. For those of you who could hear it, two things probably stood out. One, these are very subtle differences. It's really hard to make out much in these clips at all. But second, even with that subtlety, you could probably tell the difference between that first clip, which was directed towards a white driver who was stopped, and that second clip, which is more terse, directed towards a black driver who was pulled over. So in a second set of studies, we had participants listen to these clips. For each one, rate how respectful, friendly, and at ease the officer seemed with the driver. And again, we obtain these ratings from people in the lab, people at the DMV office, and in a completely separate set of stimuli to ensure the generalizability of these results. And given the subtlety of the cue, we were surprised that we found disparities at all. Also, in light of the fact that participants couldn't tell what the officers were saying or who they were talking to. But nonetheless, we did observe that participants perceived officers' tone of voice as communicating more respect towards white versus black drivers who were stopped. So this is a small difference, but I want you to think about what this might mean over a longer time span than just a 5-second clip, right? What this might mean over the course of an interaction or over repeated interactions. And so in the next part of my talk, I want to look at just that. I'm going to ask, what are the implications of these disparities in officers' communication for how community members form impressions of policing organizations? In other words, how might your perception of a police department change if you're exposed to the types of interactions that black drivers or white drivers have at the police? So we can answer this question for the first time because A, we know how police officers are communicating, and second, we can randomly assign these stimuli to participants. So I spent a lot of time at the DMV for this research. On another trip, we loaded up these audio clips that you listen to onto tablets, and we asked DMV customers to listen to repeated clips and then form an impression of a fictional police department. What we didn't tell participants is that they were assigned to one of two conditions. Half of the people in our study listened to clips pulled at random from our set of black-directed clips. The other half of our participants listened to clips of officers interacting with white men. And so in addition to getting their impressions of how the officers themselves were communicating, we asked them follow-up questions about what they thought about the police department these clips were ostensibly sampled from. So in other words, how much does this department care about the community? How much would you trust the judgment of police officers in this agency? And to what extent do you feel that officers in this department would treat you fairly? So we predicted that these relatively small differences that we observe at the individual clip level would accumulate over time. And that's exactly what we found. So when people were asked to make a judgment about the totality of the clips that they listened to, our participants who were randomly assigned to hear police officers' interactions with white men reported being exposed to more positive interactions, where police officers are more at ease, more friendly, and more respectful of the driver. I think the more important finding is that these differences in an interpersonal cue as subtle as a police officer's tone of voice translated to the inferences our participants made about the larger agency. So again, participants don't know who the officer's talking to. They don't know what the officers are saying, but they could, they did respond based on these interpersonal cues that they had more trust in the police department that, based off of exposure to just police officers talking to white drivers. And unsurprisingly, given that participants were given some relatively minimal cues, these interpersonal judgments mediated their perceptions of the institution. So to date, this is some of the first experimental evidence that shows that officer communication, even these really subtle cues like tone of voice, can undermine institutional trust in the police. So what I'd like to do now is show you some additional data from the study, which then closes the loop and looks at how differences among individual participants' perceptions and experiences shapes what they hear in this relatively ambiguous communication cue. So what this graph is showing us is the same data that I just presented. What we have on the y-axis here is just a standardized effect size, looking at the relationship between the race of the person that the officer is talking to and participants' perception of officer communication. And based on the literature, we were interested in to what extent participants themselves would vary in these judgments. So again, very minimal cue, kind of sounded like Charlie Brown grown-ups talking. And we were interested in whether participants' own experiences would matter for their judgments. And if so, whether those experiences would be those that were particularly tied to procedural fairness and perceptions of past respect from police officers, or whether they're just tied to participants' experience of positive or negative outcomes that they handed to police. Another way of thinking about this was, to what extent would it matter if the last time I sped I got a ticket versus the last time I sped a police officer treated me with respect? And so what we found is that participants' individual trust in the police correlated with their perceptions of officers' tone of voice. Unsurprisingly, those who had more trust in this institution viewed these interpersonal cues more positively. However, this didn't just seem to be an effect of just general, positivity in interactions with the police. So another thing that we found is that participants who reported more fair interactions with law enforcement also viewed these clips more positively, but there was no relationship between the positivity or negativity of the outcomes people experienced with these judgments. In other words, it didn't matter whether people had gotten tickets or warnings when they were asked to make these judgments about how officers were communicating. All right. So taken together, these data suggest a cycle that can undermine police community trust, where differences in how police officers communicate with different members of the public can translate to eroded trust in those institutions. And in turn, those experiences and those perceptions shape how people disambiguate parts of subsequent interactions. So what I'd like to shift to in the last part of my talk is to think about how we can change these interactions. So recall, one of the main ideas of the speaker series is that if you have a specific model of racial inequality or a specific model of bias, it shapes what you think can be done to address those biases. And so one of the limitations of psychological models of bias that have focused exclusively on individuals' thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors has led to interventions that have been primarily designed to target those, right? So you can think about implicit bias trainings or similar programs as trying to change officers' individual discretionary judgment. What these data suggest is that we might gain more traction by thinking about how police officers communicate with the public, by focusing our efforts on interactions and not just individuals. And so in our most recent work, my colleagues and I have done just this. So based off of the findings from the first study I talked about, looking at those racial disparities in respect, we helped design training in the Oakland Police Department that was widely oriented around procedural justice, but also had this component about communication during routine traffic stops. So I want to be clear about some of the ways in which we delivered this intervention. This was not us scolding police officers in a lecture. I only do that during my own classes. This was a police officer delivered intervention, walking through these results, what they communicated, what they didn't, and also giving concrete recommendations. Another part that was really important here is that every officer in the room when these trainings were delivered could relate to the experience of basically having to clean up another officer's disrespect, of being put in a situation which they felt was unfair because of community members' prior interactions with law enforcement. By extension, one of the messages of this training is that police officers can either make their colleagues' jobs easier or harder in terms of how they communicate with the public. So this is a slide from the training. There are 5 takeaways. And what excited me most about this is that we could actually use body camera recordings to measure what matters here. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the measures we have of police behavior are pretty impoverished. And that's really important when it comes to evaluating trainings that are meant to change the relationship between police officers and communities. They're meant to change these interactions. So because there's no good way of capturing these interactions, most of the evidence that we have about procedural justice training comes from either direct observation or really distal measures like citizen complaints. But body camera footage lets us directly observe these interactions, do so in a way that is unobtrusive and doesn't interfere with officers' behavior. And you can think about this footage as being a constant stream of data. So what this lets us do is look at traffic stops that occurred within a 4-week window after an officer was trained. And then we can go back in time and actually see how those officers were communicating before they received the training. So this training was rolled out over the course of a year. And we could basically use this staggered rollout to look at stops that were occurring at the same point in time, but were being conducted by either an officer who is recently trained or an officer who was about to go through the training. And one of the advantages of this particular training is that it gave us very concrete ways to evaluate whether this training was successful or not. So the 5 recommendations should be familiar for you from the first part of the talk, but officers were told to introduce themselves to members of the public. So we could go to transcripts and see whether they said things like, "How's it going? I'm Officer Camp, Oakland Police." We could see whether they provided an explicit reason from the stop in the transcript. So saying things like, "I stopped you because you ran that stop sign," instead of, "Where's the fire?" Or I'm sure everyone here has received like, do you know why I pulled you over?" Type of justification for a stop. And then again, some of the same features that we looked at as being strong correlates with respect, we could see if officers use them more following the training. So whether they use reassuring language by saying, "That's okay, do you happen to have your ID with you?" Whether they use formal titles with the driver, "sir" and "ma'am" instead of "bro" or "dude." And whether the officer closed by expressing concern about the driver's safety. So whether they said things like, "just want you and your family to be safe," or "just drive safe." Okay. So this paper is coming out tomorrow. So you're the first to receive this news. I just want to say that independent of these effects, I think body camera footage provides a really useful tool for agencies and the public to see what the consequences of these trainings are for police interactions. And with this particular training, we observed that officers employed a greater number of these techniques in stops that occurred post-training. They were over twice as likely to use all 5 of those recommended techniques. And these findings were robust to features about the officer, driver, and the final outcome of the stop. So I will say 2 caveats for interpreting these data. First is that stops are over dispersed. Most officers make very few stops. So just as you can't really compare teachers who have only like 2 or 3 students, we can't make predictions at the individual officer level. Rather, these are comparisons made at the stop level, controlling for officer level variability. The second thing I'll say is that this intervention did not reduce racial disparities in respect. Rather, it seemed to improve all interactions. And we observed these treatment effects in a sample that consisted mostly of African-American drivers. Another advantage of body camera footage and of using these tools to evaluate them is that they also let us get specific and look at what features of these interactions changed and what features didn't. I'm just going to put all of these up on the screen. And so really where we see this intervention being effective is that officers are more likely to explicitly state the reason for the stop, express concern for the driver's safety, and to reassure the driver in stops that occurred within 4 weeks of their training. In retrospect, it probably should have been obvious to us that most officers began by greeting the driver. So we have a bit of a ceiling effect there. And for the formal titles, there's kind of an interesting story around that. We observed that police officers were somewhat more likely to use formal titles post-training with white drivers and more likely to use informal titles with black drivers post-training. In interviews following this training, one possibility is that officers were trying to build rapport through the use of informal titles. So another valuable part of having this kind of fine-grained information is that it gives us ways to iterate. We're also able to revisit these recordings after the fact and find that officers are more likely to solicit questions from drivers in stops that occurred post-training. Say things like, is there anything I can answer for you, or do you have any questions for me? So I'd like to close with a theoretical point, a methodological point, and a practical point. The theoretical point is that a lot of work in psychology has been done thinking about what teacher-student relations, what doctor-patient relations, what police officer-community relations, how they're similar to the kinds of dyads or roommates or friends that we might examine in the lab. But less theoretical and empirical work has been done considering what makes these interactions unique. And specifically, these interactions give us a way of studying institutions as well as individuals, because institutional interactions act as the point of contact between individuals and the institutions they represent. The practical point is that because these interactions bridge levels, they can be a really potent way of targeting institutional change. In other words, rather than exclusively focusing on individual beliefs or attitudes, this work suggests that we can gain more purchase by trying to intervene on those interactions themselves. And the methodological point is that one reason why so many of these questions go unanswered is that we don't have solid ways of measuring them. So hopefully today I've convinced you how body camera footage can be a source of data to both capture trends at the department level, trends over time, and efforts to change those patterns. So with that, I'd like to thank you and open it up for questions. Yes. Yeah, so this is an enduring question in policing about to what extent does officer race matter for these exchanges. I can say three things. First, in our data, we don't observe differences based off officer race or concordance between the officer's race and the driver's race for respect. Second thing I'll say is it's very hard to make officer level judgments just because we have relatively few stops per officer. And the third thing I'll say is that research in other areas here is mixed. So there's some research with traffic stops that suggests that officers' race isn't really pertinent to search or seizure rates. There's other work looking at the Chicago Police Department, which suggests a relationship between police officers' demographics and how likely they are to use force against Black community members or to conduct searches that don't find anything. So here we didn't observe any differences. It's not to say that different people might police in different ways. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting. Thanks for showing the data, teaching process and all that, machine learning and whatnot. Yeah, I guess my two questions that are related to the population or the same situation. I'm curious as to why you focus on Oakland. It's very diverse with large Asian population, Hispanic population, or what, Oakland, California, right?
Yep.
So why only Black and white comparisons, number one, given that I think it might be enriching to see if there's where the real differences are, type of thing, you know? And then kind of relatedly, my knowledge of that area is that I think you addressed the confounding in some capacity, but I was following it. But when I'm looking at this, just sort of for myself as a police officer in that environment, if my goal would be to establish a rapport with the civilians one way or another, and you describe it as respect or lack thereof, but a lot of, at least the examples that I saw, they were sort of casual versus formal, you know. And if you see somebody who's sort of younger or maybe working class and drives a kind of car, and so you're likely to be formal. And if you have a older gentleman or it's not just one variable, but the habits in general, you know, the kinds of, and I think Oakland, I think what kind of white folk that maybe around there, maybe more affluent and educated and nicer cars, you know,
yeah.
versus Black folk, they may be, you know. So did you?
No, I hear what you're trying to say.
This kind of a complex confounding.
Right. So let me address the respect versus formality point first, because I think it's the most straightforward. That was something we worried about too, and so we actually decomposed those ratings on those 5 items, like formality, respect, friendliness, all that, into both respect and this kind of formality component. And where we really see the differences across driver race is in that principal component that correlates with partiality, politeness, and respect. So this does seem to be respect and not formality per se. Second issue, it's a general challenge with inference using body camera footage because we're limited to the stops that officers made. And so, we haven't looked at like the make of the car and things like that. What we're interested in here is just for a given black driver who stopped, what are those first moments like? What's the trajectory of that interaction? There's been some interesting work out recently that looks at traffic stop behavior that suggests that even looking at searches and those kinds of decisions, people who drive nicer cars get searched less. But even once you control for that type of vehicle, like what's the status and all that, there are also pretty profound racial disparities too. The first question about why we looked at white and black drivers, those were composed the largest portion of traffic stops in Oakland. In the training data that I showed, we actually, we didn't put those restrictions on it. These effects are just if you take a random sample, it's if you just look at all the stops that happen pre or post training, but we just don't have enough stops of Asian or Hispanic drivers to make those comparisons. I'll also say one weakness of using this natural language processing approach is that it's very kind of bound to language, right? And this, this comes out in multilingual cities. So sometimes people see the natural language processing model and they kind of zone out, but it's one of the important limitations of taking this approach. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
But in training, did all police officers in Oakland get trained, or because everybody got trained?
Yeah, so everyone got trained, but given the size of the force in that they could only pull, a certain proportion of officers into the training out of service. This was basically rolled out over an entire year.
It couldn't opt out.
Correct. Yeah, it was a mandatory training.
And the same question. Do you have any data on how long these effects lasted?
Right. So we're limited in that we're looking at a 4-week pre or post training window. I can tell you 2 pieces of good news and 1 piece of bad news. The bad news first is that we just observed a secular decline in the use of these features over 2018, which was independent of these training effects, which is kind of surprising. The good news is that looking within that 4-week period, we didn't notice differences in officers' use of these strategies if they were like 1 day post-training or if they were 4 weeks post-training. I forget the other piece of good news, but I know there was one. So, thank you. Yes?
So this clearly took a lot of collaboration and cooperation between the research team and the policing departments. Can you describe how those relationships were formed and fostered, and how did you get such access?
So part of the context for this study was Oakland Police Department has been under consent decree for going on like 20 years. So part of that consent decree was conducting an audit of their body camera footage. And so that was the impetus for the first study that I talked about. Having viewed those results, we wanted the department and members of the community approached us about how to actually try to change some of these dynamics. I'll say that the department was very open and interested in using these data, not running from them, but actually trying to have the accurate interpretations disseminated and iterate on them, or rather to try to address them. Interdisciplinary work, those institutions, I could probably give another talk on what that experience is like. But I think that really is both a combination of us being able to conduct that initial study and us also maintaining that relationship to not just say like, you guys you have this disparity, buy and see it, but actually try to measure attempts to change. Yes?
Hi, thank you. This is great. 2 quick questions. My first one is related to the type. So basically here you focused on language spoken, whether it's the words they said or the tone of voice. I'm curious how much research has been done or interventions possibly focusing on nonverbal behavior, so the body language or facial expressions from the officer. And then my second question, going off of that, I'm interested in how much research has also been looking at like the dyadic nature of the interaction. So here you focus on interactions, which is great, and we're seeing movement there, but it's mostly focused on the officer. So I'm curious whether there's been research looking at how the officer's language or behavior influence the driver's language or behavior and how that kind of unfolds most.
Yeah, so those are two excellent questions. The first one is just about like what behaviors in the interaction should we try to intervene on. We recommended these because they seem the most controllable. If you can think back to the model features, some of those were like disfluencies like and ah. Some were kind of features like keep your hands on the wheel that were that could be related to like the actual like context of the stop. So these were, you know, in linguistics they call them speech acts, but they're things that people can use more intentionally. So that's why we try to specifically target this. For the question about you know, what bringing in more of the dyadic nature of these encounters, that's an excellent question, and it's one that we wondered about too. There's a few challenges in doing so. One is officer-driver interactions are ones that are content's very heavily driven by one party. Let's just say that, and so what the community member says is often bounded by what the officer initiates with. Another challenge is in deciding what constitutes respectful or disrespectful language. And I'll give an example. Officer says, like, you don't mind if I have a look around, do you? Which is interpersonally, kind of conversational. Legally, it's consent to search. And the driver says, I actually want to talk to a lawyer. Is that driver being respectful? Or are they asserting their rights? And so I totally think one limitation of this approach that we've taken is that it kind of drains some of the, I'll also add that there's a quite variable number of words that a driver says in an interaction. It is perfectly valid to just remain silent in the traffic stop and just give material, say, thank you, then go, which makes it harder just like statistically to analyze your language. But, you know, I think it is a future direction to try to really bring more of conversational nature of these interactions into it.
Yeah, I feel like it would be interesting just to see like all the things you were saying. Like as the DV is how does the driver respond? Like do they say it or do they not?
Yeah, and I can give a concrete example of one of the things that makes this challenging. My colleagues and I did a study looking at police officer language in stops that escalated to an arrest, handcuffing, or use of force, or stops that did not. And we found that we could classify above chance just from like the first, I think it was 45 words the officer says. And so one of the things that these results led us to wonder was like, what is the driver saying in these interactions? And it turned out most of them, the driver hadn't even said anything to begin with. So it's both, like, it makes it really challenging because as much as these can resemble conversations, they often resemble very one-sided ones. Yes?
Yeah, I actually want to follow up on that. So I had the same question, but let me ask the more general version. Because in a traffic stop, it occurred to me that there's more than one actor in an institutional role. That is, the driver, one stop, gets a membership card for these 10 to 15 minutes as a member of this institution. And the question I have, it's hard to capture what's going on verbally. What do they come to understand about their role? Or what training are they getting about their role as a member of this institution? And what sort of hypotheses, what sort of speculation, what sort of theory might you have about what institutional role a driver or a citizen is gaining in those 10 or 15 minutes when they're playing their role?
Yeah, so the term of art here is legal socialization. And it's like, how do people come to know their role in the legal system? And one of the things that's really distinct about law enforcement is that it's one of the most common interactions that we have. Like the traffic stop is the most common interaction that we have with policing, that we have with the criminal justice system, and perhaps the state. And so one of the what I see as one of the contributions of this work is saying very interpersonal parts of those relationships trickle up to not just how you view that officer, or not even how you view police officers as a social group, but how you view that institution that they're a part of. Like, your relationship with a particular officer typically begins and ends in a traffic stop. Your relationship with that institution is ongoing and carries forward. And I think that's true of many institutions, but I think in policing you can really see it, right? Because officers are wearing the same uniform, they're subject to central command, and both the interpersonal and the institutional parts of that relationship are really on display. But I would argue that some of the same findings and concepts here would translate to other domains as well.
You mentioned in your answer to Emily about the sort of role of attribution of the language, like asking a question could be interpreted in multiple ways. And I was just curious, in the context of the 2x2, I think you called it respect model coefficients. Like, where are those weights coming from? Are they theory driven? Are they from your data? Are they from
These?
No, it was a 2x2, black, white, and there was like different features of language that showed the almost linear pattern
Oh, yes. Okay.
of positivity.
Yep. Right here?
This one. Yeah, so where are these sort of respect model coefficients coming from?
Yeah, so this is just coming from the algorithm where, like, each one of these features, so we had more features that dropped out of the model. You're trying to find what set of features is most predictive of participants' judgments of respect, and specifically that respect component, so parceling out the formality part.
So this is bottom up from your data?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. We identified the candidate features top down, but these are the features that emerged from the model selection. And then for each of these features, we just calculated, are they more likely to occur in stops of white or black drivers? Yes.
Thanks for the great presentation. So I have two questions that are related to each other. First one is, with the intervention that you did with the police training in the Oakland Police Department, first one is, was that training mandatory or was it voluntary for the officer? And then the second question is, building on that, I would just love to hear your thoughts more broadly about, when you think about taking this knowledge to scale, how do you feel about making these trainings mandatory or voluntary versus voluntary? And do you predict, potential effects it would have on the overall effectiveness of the training?
Right. So this training was mandatory. Implementing interventions is its own science and its own art. So I think some messages that were really crucial as intervention were the fact that some of the messages were coming from officers talking to other officers, and this was a common experience of basically having to, from the officer side, interacting with a community member and feeling like there are preconceptions based off of how another police officer treated them. I think, two words in the intervention that always make me nervous are mandatory training. But I will say that police officers do a lot of reskilling and a lot of training as part of their professional licensure. So one of the challenges to intervening in policing is that there's 16,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, and there's no common data, and there's also no common language when it comes to these trainings, besides just a few core ones. So I think my recommendation is that more and more departments are realizing that procedural justice is something that they want to pursue, and that it's important for their legitimacy as an institution. And so I think folding this in can be a really critical component, especially since it gives really concrete things that officers can do. So I'm apprehensive about mandatory trainings, but I think to the extent that officers have reskilling and retraining as part of their professional development, I think folding these lessons in can be really beneficial. Great. Any last?
That's a quick follow-up to that.
Follow-up, and then.
So how is this intervention, how is it framed towards officers? Did they know the goal of the training? Was it packaged in a different way? Were they be less apprehensive towards it? I'm just really curious about it.
Yeah, so this training was a component of just procedural justice training, and some of the other aspects of the training were focusing on procedural justice internal to the OPD as well as interactions with the public. One portion of it was on how to establish procedural justice, like why is it important for policing, what does the science tell us, and a portion of that was this particular work on language. So, I think when the OPD disseminated this training, they tried to make sure it's like more of a conversation and less of like, you're bad, say these things, like move on, and more kind of like, here's why you should care about procedural justice. Here's some of the things that you and other officers experience, and here's some concrete ways in which you can communicate this to the public.
Yeah, I guess I'm still a little hung up on the respect versus code switching kind of interpretations. I'm wondering if you've done the training, but have you shared these results or with interacting with the police themselves and kind of show that we have this footage, further footage, not just the audio, they can see, kind of a client they're interacting with, and it'd be interesting seeing if the police agree with you that they are indeed being more disrespectful versus if they would say that, well, we're just, he's a different kind of guy, a different kind of person, we talk differently. Have you shared these results and kind of like validated through the, shall we say, the lived experience of the police themselves?
Well, respect is a tricky thing because, well, this is being recorded, so I'm not going to talk about my marriage. But there are definitely things that I find respectful that the other party does not find respectful. And I guess the question of policing is whose perceptions matter more? And the answer from procedural justice at least would be it's whether that community member feels respected or disrespected. I think it's a really interesting question as to how much those features, how much they mesh. In fact, there's some research that suggests that even like there's a gap between what officers are doing in these interactions and what community members take away. So I think that's a really rich area. And I would love to see what features of language where there's agreement, concordance, or discordance. And I think the example of formal titles is one that really made us think because it's so much of it depends, right? Because when I don't have a relationship with you, if I called you like bro or dude, it kind of implies a sense of familiarity. And in some cases that familiarity can be taken up, in some cases it doesn't. So this model and none of our analyses are meant to be the last word, pun intended, but I think they do kind of open up the question that once we have a transparent model, it leaves it open for us to kind of discuss and critique these features. And so one of my concerns watching industry and others move into this space is that some of the other models that you could use to ask similar questions aren't quite so transparent with how those weights are calculated, which makes it harder to diagnose what those models are doing and to critique their development.
So just for my question, have you shared these? Have you like gone through these with the police officers and do they agree that we were disrespectful here and not and so on?
Disagree.
I don't mean the results, but the data, the actual interactions.
Right. So, showing raw footage is always a touchy subject, especially if that footage is taken from other people in your department. But we have walked through like composite transcripts based on these features, and it's pretty apparent from officers, community members, police leadership, city councils, like which officer they would like to interact with, and which ones they'd like to have as their colleague. All right. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone, and we can get out with some time to enjoy the daily. Thanks, and then next week our speaker will be Efrain Perez, visiting us from UCLA. See you next week.